Today we're going to talk about Aria by Eugene Bozza. This is one of the standards of the classical saxophone repertoire, and it really is a very pretty piece. I think it's played not super well, and I think a lot of that has to do with the fact that younger people especially overlook how difficult the intonation and the endurance for this piece can be. For this lesson, I'd like to focus on those two things. I'd like to focus on intonation and endurance. First, let's talk about intonation. There are two ways we deal with intonation and changing our pitch to be in tune, right? We use our embouchure and air, right? That's kind of one way, is we adjust physically to make the note either go lower or higher. And we also use alternate fingerings that can adjust the note for us. Now, there are plenty of places in this piece where we have to use our embouchure and air. But I think what might be most beneficial would be to walk you through the spots where I use a lot of alternate fingerings, and I can show you those. They certainly apply to more pieces of music than the Bozza Aria, and they certainly apply to more parts of the aria than we're going to discuss. What I've done is I've taken out an excerpt from rehearsal 3 to rehearsal 4, and I'm going to walk you through the fingerings I use and give you sort of a demonstration of how they work. Now, the first fingering is B key down. Now, this is on your D. Now, we know that D in general is a really sharp note, right? And this is even more of a problem here because we're in a very quiet dynamic. So we have to deal with this sharp note that is going to go even sharper because it's played really quiet. Now, the way to do that is to put down, in this context, your low B key. So you have your D, and then you just add the low B key to it. You can see it, and you can hear how the pitch changes when I add it. It lowers the pitch. Now, adding that low B will actually lower the pitch on the D, the D sharp, and the E, which can be really helpful for some passages later in this piece, right? Now, we brought the D down. The next note is C sharp. Now, the C sharp is usually flat. This is a real problem area in this piece because if you go from the D and you're really sharp and you go to a C sharp and you're flat, then the interval's way too wide and it sounds terrible, right? So we've already adjusted the D. Let's adjust the C sharp. So one thing we can do to fix the C sharp because it's flat is we can use what's called a covered C sharp fingering, which is really just a D with the top two fingers removed. Now, I love this fingering because what it does is a good example of an alternate fingering that accomplishes all three things we want alternate fingerings to accomplish, right? It makes the facility easier because we're only moving 2 fingers instead of 7 fingers. It makes the intonation better because it actually raises the pitch of the C sharp, and it matches timbre, right? Timbre is the texture of the sound, right? Those are the 3 reasons we use alternate fingerings. We use it for facility, intonation, and timbre. Now, let's give a little example. If I play the regular D with the B key down, and I play it to regular C sharp, open C sharp, what it sounds like is sort of uneven. The texture of the sound is not, it doesn't match. And the C sharp is flat. But if I use covered C sharp, the timbre matches better and the intonation's better. This is a great fingering to use in this spot. Now, the next measure, what you'll see are 2 more C sharps, but we don't use covered here. It would be way too technically awkward to do so. These pitches are on passing tones and they're not long lyrical notes. It's not going to be something we can't manage just by sort of tightening up the embouchure just a little bit. Biting, I hate to say biting, but just biting a little bit, biting that pitch up. You don't want it to sound constricted, but when you're using it in a passing tone, if you bite, you can actually raise the pitch and you won't really hear how it sounds a little stressed, right? So in this case, the open fingering works quite well. The next fingering you'll see is a longer C sharp. This again is for C sharp, right? And for this C sharp, it's a lyrical C sharp. It's very pretty. It's a longer note. It really needs to be in tune and we don't want to bite it. So what we do here is we add RS2, which means right side key 2, which is here, right? You just add that to your C sharp and it raises the pitch. And that's really helpful there. We don't want to use covered C sharp. It would be awkward and the timbre, the texture of the note wouldn't match the notes around it. But that side key, right side key added to it just raises the pitch and it keeps the color. It works really well. Now the next fingering is really kind of a small thing. It's 1 and 5 to produce an A sharp. Most of you that have played this piece probably use side A sharp, which honestly would be fine. If you were in a lesson, I wouldn't get upset about it. As a general rule, I try to move as few fingers as possible to minimize any mistakes or blurbs, right? Then when you go from 1 to 5, from B to A sharp to B, B, A sharp, B, you move 1 finger down and then 1 finger to change back to B. When you go to A sharp, side A sharp, 2 fingers down and 2 fingers up. More possibility for a little blurb. It's not a huge thing, but it's the fingering I use, so I figured it would be good to share it with you. Now next, you have a D and an E, where we have the B key down again to lower the pitch. But in this context, we have to be very careful to get off that low B key before we get to the G. And we can get off of it during the F sharp. We have plenty of time to do it. If we don't, the G will then be a half step off. It'll be a G sharp. Most of you probably know that your left pinky finger, all the keys that it operates, it controls the G sharp mechanism, right? So it opens to the G to a G sharp, all these keys. So you have to be very careful to get off your low B key before you get to the G. Now, the next section uses more of the same type of fingerings. We're able to keep the B key down for a longer period of time and without affecting anything except for the notes that it brings down for us because there's no G natural that would be raised. So the reason we keep the B key down instead of lifting it up and down is because when we're playing quiet, we want to try to minimize superfluous noise. And the B key, even if you try to be quiet, can be kind of noisy. So you got to be real careful about when you put it down and you bring it up to do it as few times as possible, just to make sure that we don't get in the way of our beautiful playing with this clanking key noise. The final part of this section is a side D. Now for most people, side D on alto is going to be LS2 and with your second finger down for C. Now some altos, depending on how it's set up, you may not use the second key for your C, you may just have LS2, left side key 2 down. But most cases you use both. Now this is a really good fingering here for the same reasons that the C sharp, the covered C sharp was good earlier, right? It actually is more in tune, it's technically easier, and it matches the timbre of the section better, the texture of the sound. If I play this with a regular D, listen to how the notes don't match. But if I play with side, all of a sudden the timbre of the notes matches much better and it sounds prettier. This seems like a small thing, but all these things, remember, they really add up to the listener. Now the next section we're going to look at is starting in measure 53, but going into measure 54. Now this uses the covered C sharp, it uses the low B key down for the D sharp and the E, which lowers the pitch of both those and darkens the sound. It's really nice. But we keep that low B key down all the way through because we have some G sharps. And it affects those in that it works as your G sharp key, right? So you don't need to bring it up. You just keep it down all the way through this passage and it works really well. Okay, the next thing in this lesson is endurance. And I've heard many people come out and play recitals where they have this piece, and they'll play a technical piece, something that's really, really hard, and they'll just kill it. It's so good, right? I mean, like the technique is just right on, it sounds great. And then they get to something slow that requires some endurance, like this piece, and they fall in the face. And the reason is because they apply really good practice technique to the fast stuff. Repetition, incremental improvement, starting slow, small sections, repeat, 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 right? They know how to do that. But when it comes to learning it in something that has endurance, that requires that physical stamina, they don't know how to develop it, and they don't do it. Now, the thing is, we approach it the same way we approach learning technique. It's just a little bit tweaked, okay? We still want incremental improvement, and we still want repetition. So what I do when I play a piece like this is I start with playing a section of it as far as I can to where I get a little uncomfortable, and then I continue for a bit. You don't want to go until you feel like you're going to have an aneurysm, okay? Don't do that. That's a terrible idea. Just go to where you're slightly uncomfortable and then stop, okay? Then the next day add a measure, maybe 2 measures. Give yourself enough time before you have to perform this. And then what you eventually want to do is to get all the way through the piece, take a breath, start over, and get all the way through it again. This is kind of what I do, and if I can get through it twice and I still feel reasonably comfortable, then I know that I'm ready to play it in a recital. Now, one of the things that's so important with endurance, with this piece in particular, is your breathing. Because you don't have any place to rest, you really got to plan your breaths carefully. And a lot of times when we have the urgent need to breathe, it has much more to do with needing to expel carbon dioxide than it does with inhaling oxygen, right? So make sure that you give yourself a place where you can exhale as well as inhale. I have marked spots where I have to remember to exhale and inhale, and there's actually one spot where I just exhale, right? You got to give yourself space to where you can take breath in to use the breath and get rid of that stale air. Make sure when you plan your breaths that you plan them in appropriate musical spots, but that you use the same breaths every time. And they'll be different for everybody. There are plenty of places in this piece that are appropriate to breathe, and there's sometimes in phrasing where we have to get kind of insistent that breathing must be in a certain place. But in this piece, there are all sorts of places that work really quite well. My breaths are very different than Dr. Rousseau's breaths, but I think his are fine. It's just that for me, for pacing, these work a little bit better for me. So I think that if you want to choose where you breathe, just make sure that you do it the same way every time. Don't wing it in a performance. It will not work out for you. I've seen so many people get to the end of this piece, and it's really kind of sad because it's this beautiful ending, and if they've done a good job, you're into it to that point, and then all of a sudden you see their face turn bright red and their veins start popping out, and there's no way to enjoy that like watching someone suffer, even if they're playing something beautiful. So really work on your endurance. I think it will pay off. Thank you for watching this lesson. Now I'll present to you a bit of my recording that I did at Minnesota Public Radio with Teresa Tula on piano, and thank you for watching.